killings, disappearances, tortures, etc. However, Torrijos is also very widely remembered because his government negotiated and signed the Torrijos-Carter treaties in 1977. This is a very, very long story that we don't really have time to tell today, but as a summary, what these treaties did is that they overruled the original 1903 Panama Canal treaties. And what that means is that it established a process for the transfer of the control of the canal from the US to Panamanian control. And this process ended in December 1999. As a result, it also meant the end of the canal zone, which was sort of a US colonial enclave that extended 10 miles alongside the canal. Very long story. We can talk about that in the question section later. But that obviously complicates the memories around Torrijos, right? So he dies in 1981, and after that, there's a little bit of a struggle for power, after which Noriega, Manuel Antonio Noriega, the man in the middle, assumes control, and he stays in power until 1989, when the invasion happens. So the novel I'm going to talk about today is very focused on the invasion. So just as a bit of context, on 20th December, is someone trying to come in? Maybe. Noriega came to haunt us. Please, no. So on 20th December 1989, the US deployed over 26,000 soldiers in Panama as part of what was called Operation Just Cause. The official justification of this operation was to overthrow and arrest Manuel Antonio Noriega because he had been indicted for drug-related crimes a couple of years before, including money laundering, racketeering, etc. Just to put this in context, the population of Panama back in 1989 was of 2.3 million people. This was it's still a very, very small country back then, much less populous. So I think that puts the sort of level of the attack in perspective, right? As a result, obviously, eventually, Noriega surrendered. He was arrested, eventually convicted. But the invasion, which was the most violent military operation the US had had since Vietnam, caused what is still an uncontested, still disputed number of deaths. There's a considerable difference between the numbers that the US accepts and the numbers that human rights organizations sort of propose. And the destruction of entire neighborhoods, as we can see there. This led to a displacement of over 15,000 people, a number of people were arrested, etc. It also, in a more political sort of way, led to the instatement of a democratic government that was sworn in a US military base and the complete disarticulation of Panama's military forces, right? So that is a very fast-paced, quick overview of the historical context we're working with here. In my research, I'm quite interested in how these memories of difficult past, because obviously we know these are experiences of state and foreign violence, but they sit sort of uncomfortably with the idea of, okay, there was a terrible dictatorship, but there was a transfer of the canal, and there was a terrible invasion, but there was a reinstatement of democracy, right? So these ideas sit kind of uncomfortably together, and they create quite complicated memory narratives. I'm interested in how these narratives of difficult pasts interact with this idea of the country as a place of transit. So I use a concept that's been coined by Panamanian scholars, which is transitismo, which I sort of translate to transitism very basically. And it refers to an economic model that is centered around the route of transit. Since the time of colonial rule, of Spanish colonial rule, the Isthmus of Panama, as you can see here, was very quickly identified as a very strategic route because it was at the center and at the most narrowest fit of the continent, right? So this has led to this economic model that is fully concentrated on the route of transit and has developed a sort of economy of a service economy that kind of atrophies every form of productive sector because it's fully focused on this. And that naturally leads to some considerable social and economic inequalities. What I find interesting about this is that this is not only an economic model, but it has permeated Panama's social and cultural development into what anthropologist Ana Elena Porras calls the cultura de la interoceanidad, or interoceanic culture. Porras defines this as a sort of hegemonic cultural model that kind of assigns value to ideas like cosmopolitanism, commercial exchange, and a globalized economy. And what is interesting about this is that it defines the country with images such as the bridge of the world, the heart of the universe, right? These are images that sort of picture the country as a strategic route above everything else. And while this sounds very celebratory to call the country the center of everything, there's some tensions, I think, in understanding a country as a sort of commercial bridge, if that makes sense. And what I do in my research is kind of think about the difficulties of the transitism brings when dealing with memories of state violence and invasion. In a narrative that prioritizes stability for economic profit and exchange, painful memories such as the ones I was talking about just don't fit very well, right? So today I'm going to talk to you about this novel, which is called Una corona con cantáridas. Una corona con cantáridas translates to a crown with cantárides. I think that's how you pronounce that word. I'm not sure. And for those of you who don't know, because I didn't know until I read this book, cantárides is a green insect. It's usually called the Spanish fly, and it's that bug that you can see over there in the crown. The novel was published in 2018. It's by Panamanian author Rogelio Guerra Ávila. And basically, the basic plot of the novel is it narrates a story of this elderly couple, Jerónimo and Mawampi. They lived in an impoverished house in the outskirts of Panama City when the US invasion happens. And what happens is that Jerónimo goes to his backyard and he finds buried in his backyard a chest with a bunch of colonial jewels, basically. He finds a crown and some other jewels that had been hidden from a pirate attack that happened in 1671. So it uses this image to sort of connect these two experiences of invasion, so to speak. At the end, though, even though this sounds all very, very nice, the novel doesn't really have a happy ending. Mawampi, who's his wife, she suffers from dementia. She accidentally overdoses on her medication and dies. And eventually they lose the jewels. So it's just sad ending in the novel in general. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we move forward. So what I want to think about when we start to think about this novel is the context in which it was published, right? As I said, it was published in 2018. 4 years after the invasion, every request from associations of victims or relatives of victims to try to determine the number of victims from the invasion had been met with state indifference, state silence. And this changed in 2016 when the state ordered the creation of the Commission 20 December 1989. I'm going to refer to it as the Commission from now on, to investigate and try to identify the victims of the invasion. There had already been a Truth Commission a couple of years before to investigate the crimes of the dictatorship. So this was very specifically related to the victims of the invasion. Even after the creation of the commission, though, this is important to say, this didn't really mean a full change in the approach of the state. Even after the creation of the commission, there was very little commemoration of the date until 2020, when the date was declared a national mourning day. And even then, I think this tells us something about how contested these narratives are in Panama. Just as an example, last year, when it was 20th of December, Panama's current president went on a press conference and basically said that he didn't really believe that many people have died, and that he thought, there was an overreaction, an exaggeration of the numbers. So that kind of evidence is how contested this idea of the cruelty or the violence of the invasion still is. At the moment when this novel was published, the commission was still just doing archival research. They've since moved on. They're doing sort of forensic archaeological research now, excavation, and identifying the bodies from the mass graves. But this novel is published as the commission is starting to sort of excavate these remains, first from the archives and eventually the physical remains from the mass graves. And I posit that Una corona con cantáridas similarly uses images of buried bodies and objects to excavate memories that have remained buried from national memory narratives. The trope of excavation allows the novel to interweave two experiences of military invasion, obviously the 1989 one, but also the 1671 pirate attack to colonial Panama City that was led by Henry Morgan, who's the guy in the rum. This allows for an analysis of the impact in the attitudes described in the narratives of transit in Panama's relation with imperial powers throughout history. I focus on the attitudes described in the novel towards lost goods and looting, in contrast to the loss of lives, and link these attitudes with the national narratives that see Panama, above everything else, as a place of transit and commerce. Hence, I read the frustrated promises of a found treasure in una corona con cantáridas as a reflection of the unfulfilled expectations of prosperity brought by Panama's transitist economic model. So I'm going to start by telling you a bit about this pirate attack that happened in 1671 and the parallels we can draw between these two experiences of attack. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of looting, both in the 1989 invasion and the loss of material goods in the pirate attack, to go through the idea of the trope of the found manuscript, which is how the novel connects these two experiences, and then think about this frustrated idea of the treasure. So the novel starts in the opening scene. It sets it in the first days after the invasion, well, the first days of the invasion, when the US is searching civilian homes. The US was doing this to try to identify any person who would be in any way aligned with the Noriega regime, and this went from people who were in the military to people who worked in the government. So it ended with around 5,000 people who were arrested and put in camps in military bases. So that's the context in which the novel begins, right? And Geronimo, who's an old man, has an old hunting shotgun, and he says, I need to find a way to get rid of this because I don't want to be confused as a supporter or an officer, even though it was a hunting shotgun. But anyway, so he goes to his backyard to try to get rid of this shotgun. And this is significant because he chooses to bury it in the ground, right? And the first reason this is significant is because as the opening scene of the novel, it sort of sets a tone of defeat and submission in the way that this man is actively getting rid of his only means of defense, right? At the end of the novel, he's desperate to obtain money because his wife has died and he needs to bury her. So he goes back and he tries to disinter the gun in hopes of selling it to the US Army. And this is something that happened in the invasion, that the US military was buying any personally owned, privately owned guns for money. And this is seen in many novels in Panama. But it shows also this very physical act of disarticulating or disarming the Panamanians, right? So in the novel, the fact that this is the scene with which we start and we end sort of reinforces this idea of defeat in how Panamanians approached the US invasion. And secondly, the burial works as a trigger for the entire plot. As we know, when he's sort of digging the land to bury his shotgun, he finds this rusty chest with the heraldry of King Charles I of Spain. And then he finds this crown with emeralds and these jewels, right? And these jewels become sort of like the mechanism for the novel to jump back in time. In the second chapter, it goes to 1671, and it kind of recreates this story of how these jewels ended up in Geronimo's backyard. So Panama, like many other places in the sort of Caribbean under colonial rule, suffered a number of pirate attacks. That's not necessarily a new thing. However, most of the pirate attacks that happened in Panama stayed in the Caribbean side. And just for people who are not familiar with Panamanian geography, we see that the Caribbean is over here, Panama City is in the Pacific. So usually the pirates would stay in the Caribbean side because the colonial route was controlled by the Spanish, right? However, Morgan and his men managed to cross to the colonial city, and this led to the entire destruction and eventual relocation of the first colonial city, right? Geronimo's accidental excavation in the novel connects the story with the ruins of Panama Viejo, which you can see here, and that are described by archaeologist Tomás Mendizábal as the most conspicuous and perhaps the biggest archaeological site in Panama. After the city was destroyed and relocated 10 kilometers west, this area was completely abandoned until the early 20th century, when we had sort of informal settlements in the adjoining areas. And this would become eventually a working class neighborhood that exists today that's called Panama Viejo. So eventually, this became a conjunto monumental histórico, which is like a national heritage site. It's, I think, currently a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well. And since the 90s, there's been a lot of excavation and conservation projects around the area, which explains why it looks so nice here. What's interesting about these ruins, though, is that, as Mendizábal puts it, they, and particularly the cathedral tower that we see here, are a powerful identity symbol identified by the ruling white and mestizo population as the place of their roots. And I think that's very well exemplified in this picture, which I took from visitpanama.com. So it tells you everything you need to know. It's a tourism website in Panama, and it creates this perspective, right, of the cathedral being the place of origins and the modern sort of skyline in the background, right? And the reason why this place is considered the place of the Panamanian roots is quite clear. As a bit of a flashback, in 1513, Spanish conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean, and he did so from Panamanian land, right? And this is quite relevant for these narratives of transit that I talk about, because the fact that he discovered the ocean means that he discovered a route as well. He discovered the need for a route to connect both oceans, and he did it through the Panamanian Isthmus. So it sort of created this vocation of Panama as a site of transit, right? So the place, obviously, because it was founded, the city was created as a result of this, and to sort of start or kickstart any conquest that happened in South America, including obviously the conquest of Peru and so on. It was a very, very rich city, and that obviously explains why Morgan and any other pirates would have any interest in it. So the ruins of Panama Viejo contain a narrative of a prosperous past that's threatened by a foreign force. And it also, as we can see, is a past that is willingly sort of excavated and exploited for national narratives, right? So as Francine Maciello tells us when talking about ruins, it's quite interesting and it's really important how we establish continuity between past and present. And as I said before, these narratives of transit have established this continuity between the discovery of the Pacific, the foundation of the colonial city, and this vocation of the country as a bridge that is ultimately exemplified with the canal, right? So instead of doing that connection, the novel does a very different one, and it instead connects two experiences of violent invasion, right? The 1671 and the 1989 attacks thus reflect the continuity of imperialist interest over the route of transit and of colonial powers over the Panamanian territory. And so we can see a couple of parallels in how these two events took place. On the one side, we know that both of them took advantage of the route of transit. We know that Morgan had to cross the actual route, first on boat and then on foot, to reach the Pacific. And obviously, by then, the US had full control of the canal and had military bases in what was the canal zone. So it took advantage of this to assemble the thousands and thousands of soldiers it did, right? But there's also similarities even in the areas that were attacked, because obviously we know that this was the main target of Morgan, this was the colonial city. But as I said before, there's a sort of working class neighborhood that is around this. And there was a Panama Defense Forces barracks in this area. So this was also one of the main targets of the US invasion. And even when we think of the imagery that is evoked by these two attacks, they're quite similar, obviously different quality, I guess, but they're both sort of defined by the idea of consuming fire. When the pirate attack happened, the governor of the city ordered people to set the city on fire so that the pirates wouldn't be able to take anything, basically. So the images that we have of the pirate attack and that we for a time thought was caused by Morgan and his men is of the city in flames. And this is very similar to the images we have of the invasion, obviously, that was characterized by all this heavy bombing and by the destruction of working class neighborhoods that were mainly comprised of wooden houses. So obviously the imagery is also very, very flamey, I guess. And also the novel kind of uses, in both cases, the novel uses these characters that are sort of in marginal perspectives. We know that the characters in the narrative present are this impoverished elderly couple, Jeronimo and Mawampi. But even when it goes back to the past, the narrator or the perspective that we have is of a poor mestizo boy who is in charge of hiding the jewels, right? So it's in both cases sort of focusing on the anonymous victims rather than like the decision makers that would be involved in the attacks, right? When it goes back to the 1671 attacks, the boy who is in charge of hiding the jewels is called Jacinto. He's the son of a Spanish soldier and an indigenous woman left in the care of a monastery. And he's told, take these jewels, hide them outside of the city. So when he does that, and it puts in what would be Jeronimo's backyard eventually, he comes back to the city and says, okay, I'm going to fight the pirates, immediately shot with a musket, left without his figured face, right? So he's kind of part of the same idea of this anonymous death. His face is unrecognizable. We'll never know who this person was, right? And what is interesting is that when the narrator tells us about the 1671 attacks, from his perspective, the description is not that dissimilar to how we would describe the 1989 invasion. I'm going to read it in Spanish, but there's English translations there. It says, a todo lo largo del descampado había innumerables cuerpos tirados, algunos hundidos en los tremedales, otros dispuestos de cualquier forma. Eran decenas, quizás cientos, tantos que no había manera de contarlos. So there's no way to count the number of the extent or the scale of the death, right? And similarly, when Mawampi overdoses and Jerónimo takes her to the hospital, the narrator describes the hospital as una especie de moridero comunal, a kind of communal dying place, where due to the lack of beds, people were just left lying on the ground. Eventually, we know that Mawampi dies, and when this happens, an orderly in the hospital explains to him that la morgue estaba desbordada de muertos sin dueños traídos de todas partes. Se había tomado la decisión de echarlos en una fosa común para evitar que se desatara una epidemia, right? So both descriptions reflect the seemingly incalculable violence of the attacks and highlight the many bodies buried anonymously, left out of records and commemoration. The novelist is concerned with the existence of unmarked mass graves, like the ones the Commission is investigating, and to recover their memories, right? So what I find really interesting about this is that even though the imagery we have and the parallels we have kind of show us equally a city in ruins, a city in flames, this massive loss of life, massive loss of goods, the place these memories occupy in sort of identity-shaping narratives is radically different. And as example of this is that the year after this novel was published in 2019, Panama was commemorating two important events. In August 2019 was the 500th anniversary of the foundation of the city. And because the city is this massive symbol of this role and this vocation of the country as a bridge, the national and the city governments did all these events all year long. And then on the 15th of August, which was the date of the anniversary, we had newspapers saying stuff like celebrating the encounter of the worlds, and even going as far as saying that Panama founded globalization, right? And that the new world had Panama as the axis, the central axis of the conquest. So it's very over the top, the way the event was sort of celebrated. In contrast, a couple of months later, in December, the country commemorated the 30th anniversary of the invasion. And obviously, this was not the way this was commemorated. There were a number of grassroots initiatives. There were human rights organizations that organized events and whatnot. The only official response from the government was an order to fly the flag at half-mast, and that was it. So we can see a very clear disparity in how these sort of events are remembered and how they're narrated. And there's probably a million reasons why that is, but I posit that one of these reasons is Panamanians' difficulties to assigning or to identifying with a side in the conflict here. So when we talk about the destruction of Panama City, we know that Panamanians sort of identify as Spanish, right? And this sort of follows the way Panamanians have adopted Balboa, who's this discoverer of the Pacific, as a national hero, as a symbol of criollismo, exactly, and of the man remade in America. So he's been sort of adopted as a national symbol in a way. In contrast, as Ana Elena Porras tells us, Morgan has been depicted in school books, but also in the public imaginary in general, as this ultimate villain, like a soap opera villain, the only direct reason of the destruction of Panama City, even as we know that the city was burned down by Spanish authorities, right? But he becomes this trope of the official, the universal enemy, no? As Nina Gerasi Navarro states, pirate attacks mark specific instances when society as a whole unites to define itself against the enemy. So the 1671 attacks operate in memory narratives as a unifying trope essential in the formation of this transitist identity. By contrast, by 1989, the country had been through 21 years of dictatorship, 2 years of very intense US economic sanctions. So it was very difficult for Panamanians to identify themselves with the government that represented them, which was the Noriega regime. So rather than a narrative of unity in which Panamanians sort of unite against the US invader, what we have is memory narratives that place good Panamanians, whatever that is, against the regime, the looters, the paramilitary groups, the US Army, or any combination of all of the above, right? So in contrast to the stories that portray this Panamanian Spanish as these heroic figures that would rather burn down their city than see it fall in pirate hands, All the narratives about 1989 are filled with this kind of humiliation, not only because of the overpowering force of the attack, but also because of the internal divisions that were happening at the time. And when I think of that, I want to sort of focus on the idea of looting, because I find this to be one of the most fascinating things about reading about the invasion is the importance that narratives in Panama assign to the looting of the invasion and the idea of moral degradation that happens on these Panamanians who kind of turn on their equals or their peers or whatever, no? And this is something that is kind of important in the novel, because we know that Jerónimo is at home with his wife, but he's getting news from the people around him, right? So there's this itinerant seller who's called Amancio, and he brings him news, and he says, oh my God, this is happening there, this is happening here. And he hears from his neighbor, Filomena, who tells him, you know, my nephew's missing, this is happening. So he's getting all this news from these people. And these people are quite relevant because they participate in the looting. Even though he stays at home, these sort of secondary characters bring the looting to the home. And the way Filomena explains it is that she says, well, the thing is that the people who were loyal to Noriega, these criminals who are heavily armed, they are inciting people to loot, they're inciting people to break into buildings. And what she's referring to is these paramilitary groups that were organized by the military, called Batallones de la Dignidad, or Dignity Battalions, who were in theory sort of meant to be a civilian form of defense in case of a military attack by the US. But in practice, what was happening with the batallones is that they were sort of deployed as civilian tools of repression anytime there was an anti-Noriega regime, anti-Noriega protest. So what was happening is that they've ended up in any form of imaginary of the invasion and the dictatorship as lowlives, as criminals, as very violent sort of delinquents, really. So there's a very widely circulated narrative that is the Batallones de la Dignidad who instigated the looting, which is what Filomena says. And this narrative has been questioned. For example, there's a Panamanian intellectual called Jose Jesus Martinez, and he says, well, the looting really started in the heads and the stomachs of the poor, of people who were experiencing, you know, precarity and sanctions and stuff. And with Martinez, we have to sort of situate him a little bit. He was a very close friend of Torrijos, a very close advisor of the regime. So we know he was at least a little bit aligned with the dictatorship at that point. But still, regardless of what we think it started with the batallones or it started with just normal people, what is true is that the looting sort of inverts the position of who is the enemy when we think about the invasion. And as Luis Pulido Ritter mentions, it created the narrative that the enemy was no longer the foreigner, it's no longer the US invader, but it's instead the Panameño común, the average Panamanian, and it inverts this consensus of the national. So we know that the US is the one that's bombing and the US is the one that's doing the killing. We also know that in Panama, the Panama Defense Forces did the duties of the police. So by disarticulating the military, you leave the country without the police. But nevertheless, the responsibility is sort of assigned to this poor person, potentially racialized person, who is doing the looting, right? So the narrator places the justification of the looting in the batalloneros, but the justifications that the characters give are much more similar to what Martinez says. They speak of, you know, it was important for us to get provisions because we didn't know how long this was going to last. And Amancio says he anticipates días de hambre, so days of hunger. And he says, imagine that a couple of days ago, we thought we wouldn't even have stale bread for Christmas. So it reflects on the level of precarity that was happening before the invasion, considering all the economic sanctions and whatnot. However, what's interesting with Amancio is that, and that's how these narratives usually work, is that they explain that this man was struggling economically, but then he goes and loots and he gets new shoes and he gets a Christmas tree and he gets a radio. So it sort of questions the rationale of these people for looting. And in that way, the novel is not really apologetic of the looting in any way. In fact, it sort of traces Mawampi's death to the spoils, because these people are quite generous. They come and they share their spoils with the protagonist. Filomena walks into a pharmacy and she gets extra medicine for Mawampi. And Amancio goes and gets a radio and gets a bottle of aguardiente, who for any non-Spanish speaker is a form of booze. But at the end of the novel, Mawampi dies because she overdoses because there's too many medicine available. And the only reason she's able to do this is because her husband is passed out drunk with a bottle of aguardiente and she's been left sort of unattended. So there's this tracing of her death to the spoils of the looting. But nevertheless, while the text reflects on the moral and legal complexities of looting, the focus on poor people's acquisition of goods rather than businesses' losses sort of proposes a different approach to memories of the invasion centered on the precarity that both preceded and followed the invasion. This concern for material goods is also prevalent in the way it narrates the 1671 attacks. As I analyze the novel's portrayal of these events, I argue that the importance assigned to material losses can be explained by the transitist narratives that see the country as a space for commerce and trading and measure the country's value in relation to the profits made by the movement of goods. In the novel, this whole story of Jacinto is triggered by an incomplete manuscript, and in the manuscript it says, "We're not really interested in telling you the terrible things that happened. Más que participar las atrocidades ejecutadas y la deflagración final de la ciudad, el informe pretende poner a las autoridades religiosas al tanto de lo ocurrido con las joyas." So the point of the manuscript is to tell you what happened with the jewels. It's not to tell you how many people died or what happened with the victims, right? So this is quite interesting because we also know that the priest who sent Jacinto to do this says, "We've sent all the gold away, everything is safe, the pirates are not going to get anything." And this is what we see in historiographical records of the pirate attack as well. There's this man called, I never know how to pronounce his name, Alexander Excavations, I think is his name. He wrote this book about the pirate attacks in the 17th century. And he explains that when the pirates arrived in Panama City, because obviously they were crossing the route, the Spaniards knew they were coming. So they went and hid everything away, sent everything on a galleon. So by the time Morgan arrived, most of the treasures were not really there. And whatever was there was lost because the governor set the city on fire, right? So both the portrayal in the novel and the historiographical records sort of coincide in telling us that there's a prioritization of safeguarding material stuff rather than protecting people's lives, right? And so I want to focus a little bit on the idea of the found manuscript, which is what happens in the second chapter. In this chapter, we kind of build this idea out of archival fragments. The incomplete manuscript that we talk about is supposedly found in the Archivo General de Simancas in Spain. So it highlights, the importance of the written word in the colonial project. And as a trigger for the plot, what's important about the trope of the found manuscript is that it helps legitimize the veracity of a story, right? It anchors it in a supposedly historical document. We see it as a staple in fiction writing. We know it's in novelas de caballería that are parodied by Cervantes. We see it in Borges' short stories, in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. The unexpected, however, as Lindsay DeQuircy mentions in her analysis of early American fiction, this found manuscript destabilizes textual authority by its very appearance on the scene. Its unexpected discovery, while providing new information, also underscores that something has been found, but it was lost, and it can also be lost again. And this is something that the novel pays a lot of attention. The novel tells us that this manuscript had been misplaced in Lima for a bunch of years, and then it was moved to Spain, where it was with a bunch of other uninventory documents, right? So we see this document as a very perishable piece, something that is only partially recovered by chance, highlighting the limitations of archival reconstructions of the past. And this fallibility of this manuscript also helps us connect in a different way the two experiences of attacks between 1989 and 1671. When the invasion happened, the US Army seized a considerable number of documents from the Panama Defense Forces headquarters, as well as from Noriega's offices and his residences. And these documents were never returned to Panama. They are currently stored in a warehouse in about 9,000 boxes in Albany, Georgia. They are sort of rotting away. Yeah. And when this happened, in 2001, when the first Truth Commission was created to investigate the crimes of the dictatorship, the Panamanian Truth Commission said, okay, can we have these documents back because we need to investigate these crimes? And the US obviously said no. For sort of context here, it's important to know that Noriega was a very close ally of the US for the better part of the 80s, until they weren't anymore. So, and he was a very, very close ally in obviously all the anti-communist policies of the US in the Central American region, right? So there's probably a reason why these documents are still kept in the US, because they have a lot of detail about the workings of Noriega, with the story of the military dictatorship and the circumstances that ended up with the invasion, right? And there have been recent efforts to recover these files. A very partial but very commendable effort was done in 2019 by a journalist collective called Concolong, with the Commission 20 December and the Center of Human Rights of the University of Washington. They compiled hundreds of recently declassified documents from the US in this sort of project called Panama Files. And as you can see in this image here, this is like an inventory of part of the many, many documents and things that were captured, is the word they use, during Operation Just Cause. So nevertheless, these Noriega files, as historian Douglas Cox calls them, and like the incomplete 1671 manuscript in the novel, highlight the incompleteness of the archive and the difficulties in excavating these buried pasts, right? But rather than using the trope of the found manuscript as a way to ascertain the authenticity of the narration, the novel exposes the fragility of the archive and proposes an imaginative reconstruction of the past. As the narrator explains, the manuscript initially had 5 pages, only 3 survived. And as we know, it doesn't really explain to us what happened in the attack. It also doesn't tell us what Jacinto did with the jewels. It only tells us that they were given to Jacinto. So the narrator is faced with this incomplete record of the past, and it acknowledges that there is no way of knowing the full truth. And it says, cualquier cosa que consiguiéramos pensar sería simplemente una conjetura. La siguiente es una de ellas, right? So the novel highlights the impossibility of immutable monolithic narratives, rendering them insufficient to understand the country's past. Instead, it acknowledges that its narration is only one in a heterogeneous pool of memories, always in a process of reconstruction. What's interesting as well is that the found manuscript is usually a trigger for a text. We usually have it in a preface as a notice to the reader. That is not the case in Una Corona con Cantáridas. It sort of sits uncomfortably in the second chapter. So we have the story of Jerónimo, which is the main story of the novel. And then we have a little pause in the second chapter where we have the story of the found manuscript. So we know that the plot of the story is not triggered by this research happening in Simancas in the archive, even though this manuscript is buried there, but it is triggered by the physical digging of the land for the active excavation that is happening in Jerónimo's backyard, right? So the manuscript is thus another layer in an exhumation process that is triggered by the protagonist alongside the memories of the invasion. In this way, the found manuscript sort of tells us to challenge the idea of homogenizing narratives, right? And I take this a little bit further when we talk about, I see in this failed treasure a critique to a very specific homogenizing narrative, which is these narratives of transit that I told you about at the beginning. And I was thinking about this before I came here, about the idea of what cantáridas are, which we can see in the cover, and how misleading the cover is in itself, right? Because it looks like there's emeralds in the crown, and then we see that it's insects. And it turns out, after a quick Wikipedia search, that these books they were thought to be like an aphrodisiac and a health thing, and it ends up being sort of a poisonous thing. So it is even in the image in the cover, it's sort of a deceiving treasure, right? So I posit that the failure of the character's ambitions reflect an exhaustion of narratives of transitism as a monolithic national identity, and the unfulfilled promises of prosperity that were said to be brought by it. In Una Corona con Cantáridas, the hopes of wealth brought by finding the crown, prostrated at the end of the novel, are the climax in a long history of unfulfilled promises in Jerónimo and Mawampi's lives. And there's a quote by Jerónimo that sort of explains this. He says, "What have I given you in return? You know, we have an impoverished house, one dead son, another muerto en vida, un año tras otro lidiando con una modesta existencia." And here he's talking about his 2 kids, well, his 2 children, I guess. The oldest one was killed in a robbery, and the youngest one struggles with drug addiction. He's homeless, sort of a mess. And he becomes relevant at the end of the novel because, as I was telling you, we know that they're in the house, the 2 of them. Jerónimo gets drunk with the aguardiente, and he gets all these jewels, and he puts them all on his wife. He dresses her as a queen, puts her the crown and all these things, and then he passes out drunk. And when he's drunk, she goes, "Oh, my medicine," and then she reaches for her medicine, accidentally overdoses, right? In that moment, her youngest son, who's this person who's portrayed as this kind of that tropey drug addict that is willing to do anything to get some money. He breaks into the house, sees her, thinks she's asleep, takes all the jewels and runs, right? So the novel ends with, she's dead, the jewels are lost. I see this treasure excavated and lost by the protagonist as a reflection of transitism's failure to bring prosperity to all Panamanians. By the time this novel was published, it was almost 20 years after the transfer of the canal and the whole route of transit to Panamanian control. And even though we see these numbers of Panama being a very, very prosperous, sort of wealthy place, we know that there was a steady increase of the GDP. It's basically tripled in the last 30 years. It's higher than the average of the region. But this has not translated into a reduction of inequality, income distribution inequality in the country. We know that Panama has one of the highest Gini indexes of the region. It's only, I think by 2023, was the fourth most unequal country, only surpassed by Colombia, Brazil, and Guatemala. And, you know, obviously this rise in wealth inequality is not a Panamanian thing per se. It's not an exclusively Panamanian issue. It's rather part of a larger trend of neoliberalism and its consequences, right? But what's interesting in Panama is that the transfer of the canal did entail a promise of additional resources, right? Because there was a number of resources that were previously held by the US. Obviously, the revenues that came from the canal, but also access to a number of lands that were previously in a 10-mile strip. That was a lot of land that was previously held by the US, that was military bases, etc., that are now in Panamanian control, right? And this is not to say that the canal doesn't bring the revenue. It does. In 2024, I think the canal, I have it here, contributed 2.4 billion US dollars to the state finances. So it does bring in a lot of wealth, but this has not translated into a less unequal society, right? And I've brought in an example that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but it's quite recent. And it's basically a news from a couple of weeks ago when the terrible hurricane that hit Jamaica, I don't remember what it was called. When obviously these hurricanes happen, we have a lot of rain in Panama, in Central America in general. And this news came out of the number of indigenous children who keep dying because there's no bridges for them to go to school, so they have to cross these rivers on foot. So you create this massive contrast, right, between stories like this of indigenous kids that are 8 years old that are drowning in a river, and the very modernized, prosperous, wealthy city that is kind of fueled by this transitist economy, right? So although the inequalities experienced by Panamanians cannot be described as an exclusively transitist phenomenon, the disenchantment that followed is rooted in transitism's failures to provide the promised prosperity. Similar to how the characters' expectations of wealth are frustrated in the novel, the promises of liberation brought by Operation Just Cause and the return to democracy, and the hopes of prosperity given by the transfer of the canal were all frustrated by the silence that followed years of state violence and foreign invasion and the inequalities of the transitist economic model. So just to conclude, in this presentation, I have focused on the image of excavation in Una Corona con Cantáridas to reflect on the connections it draws between Morgan's attack and the US 1989 invasion. Rather than focusing on the celebratory links that narratives of transit have established between the colonial and the modernized roots, the novel connects these two violent experiences to reflect on a long history of imperial violence over the Panamanian territory and its people. Connecting the invasion with a story that's so foundational to Panamanians as the creation and destruction of the first colonial city, also highlights the marginal place occupied by the invasion and its many unnamed victims in memory narratives. The focus on the loss of material goods in the narration of both events further reflects the pervasiveness of a national narrative that sees the country's value in its role as a site for the exchange of goods. However, as I've aimed to demonstrate here, the novel, this ultimate loss of treasure highlights these limitations of the narratives of transit and reflects that even as Panama has control over the route, the transitist model has not translated into the promised prosperity. Ultimately, as the current tensions that we have in the Caribbean right now and the will he, won't he invade, that it's now part of a larger set of countries, this demonstrates that, like the found manuscript and the jewels found by Jerónimo, control over the route of transit can also be lost again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole. That was very interesting. We were literally discussing this material yesterday, but some images now are I mean, it's really good to see some images and feel, I don't know, Morgan's face.
Well, he's also in the room.
It's true. To liquid. Okay, so I'm going to kick off by asking you, how do you, if you could situate these texts in particular within the larger Panamanian landscape, and tell a little bit more about how this text connects with other aspects of your current PhD.
Yes, thank you. So this novel is, I'm focusing on my thesis on novels published after the year 2000. And the reason I'm doing this is because it marks the transfer of the canal. So it's a different position in how we're narrating ideas of transit post the nationalized canal, right? I am analyzing this novel in a sort of awkward interaction with another novel called Las canciones que el público nos pide, which means like the songs that the audience requests, I guess. And that novel narrates the story of these guerrillas in a mountainous area in Panama. And equally, I think the way I'm narrating it is using this trope of excavation and of buried pasts. But what's interesting about this novel that I didn't necessarily mention here, but it's part of that analysis with the other novel, is that there's also sort of a proposition of seeing beyond transit, and both novels create a lot of strong connections, both with the Caribbean and with Central America. I didn't mention it here, but my one piece Dominican. So it creates a lot of sort of, instead of seeing the country as this exceptional situation that happens that is crazy because it's this crazy route of transit and its vocation, it situates it as part of a larger history of US intervention, really, both in the Caribbean and in Central America. So it's basically my second analytical chapter. I am also working with these novels that are by two much more established, more canonical authors, and how they narrate kind of the experiences of the elites and how the elites influence on the creation of memory narratives. And then I finish with these novels about sort of the children of dictatorship, people who grew up in the military dictatorship.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I'm sort of, I'm not military studies person, so it's quite interesting to try and think it through from that point of view. And what struck me was, the 1671 and 1989, very, very different contexts. I mean, Panama, as such, as a nation, the idea of a nation didn't exist in 1671.
Yeah.
The colonial, it was a part of a much bigger colonial entity. Whereas in 1989, obviously, the whole trope of the nation was absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, if you could sort of say something a little bit about what difference it makes for something to be a nation rather than a sort of sub part of a much bigger colony. And the other thing was that, I like the whole idea of transitism. I thought that was very interesting. And I know that, that in the nation of Panama, its role as a transit point is obviously incredibly important. But some of the things that you connect to transitism, like an unequal society, a kind of neoliberal, global, all that kind of stuff, and that happens in many other Latin American countries that have similar kind of narratives about progress and development, and then huge levels of inequality and so on. Colombia, could be a very good example. So I just wondered what it is. What if you could sort of specify a little bit more what transitism and how it figures in the whole panorama, and particularly in your novels. I find it a bit hard sometimes to make the connection between the literary analysis and the kind of bit broader contextual.
Say that. So in your first question, there's definitely a difference, and I think part of the reason it's so differently remembered is precisely the fact that one is not necessarily an invasion, because it's not invading the Panamanian state. The Panamanian state doesn't exist. The nation state doesn't exist as a whole. But I think what's interesting is that it is such an essential part of the formation of the narratives that would create the nation state. So even though it's not an attack on the nation, I don't think that's the way it's studied or the way it's spoken about, but it's so essential to these narratives, these national narratives, that idea of, and I think that's why it's interesting how Panamanians identify as Spanish, because there's not a nation state, but they identified as that side of the conflict, and they see the English, or as I discovered recently, the Welsh, because Morgan apparently was Welsh, as this enemy, and in the same way that a Spanish in that time would have, in a way, right? So I think that's what was quite interesting. I think it's also what makes it so a little bit disappointing that when the nation state is finally conformed and there's this experience of military invasion, their response is a little bit less visceral. It's much more submissive. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. On this,
Can I ask you something about that?
yes.
Up to what extent there is, okay, the nation doesn't exist, but the city exists.
Mhm.
Up to what extent the city of Panama it becomes a metonym for national identity.
Definitely, and I think that's why it's so relevant because, and that's sort of a lot of the limitations of transitism as a sort of national narrative, right? Because the only reason the country is established, and this is quite cynical for me to say as a Panamanian, so let's not ever share this outside of here, but the only reason the state is constituted as such is because of the route, right? The route was logistically important for Spain, it was logistically important for France, it was logistically important for the US, and that ends up quite literally creating the nation state. So the idea of the nation does come from the foundation of Panama City, and that's why it's so heavily celebrated in 2019, right? Because that's where the nation comes from. It comes from that port in the Pacific and the possibility of connecting it with the Atlantic. In regards to your second question, Peter, I think that's definitely true, and it's something I've been struggling with throughout the whole PhD. Of obviously, transitism is quite a unique thing, but it's also sort of another manifestation of a larger phenomenon in the Americas. So I think that's definitely true. We see levels of inequality that obviously are higher in Brazil, for example, or in Colombia, and that are due to different things, different specificities. But at the end of the day, it's part of a larger phenomenon. I do think that what's interesting, or what makes it sort of a unique or a worth looking at case, is that this sort of economic model has created a way in which Panamanians see themselves and how they narrate their present and their past, which obviously every country has that in different ways. But it's interesting that what it's at its core, a colonial relationship with other forms of power, has informed how Panamanians understand their own past and their own sort of narrative. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicolle, for such an amazing presentation. Like you were so well delivered, like really speak, like you just like kind of takes this story. My question is about the point that is in your title that what's brought me here about fictional excavation. So because I thought what in one for both parts of this therapy. Well, in one part, I would like you to speak a little more about the idea of the excavations. I thought that in the novel, but I would like you to mention that also for your analysis. But in other sense, I was thinking the idea of fictional here, because you mentioned that like their times are as they usually are, but they're fragmented and inaccessible. And also you have this idea of like too many bodies, like no way to count these bodies. So like, would the fiction, you think, be a way to handle it, this like difficulty of recovering this memory?
Definitely. And again, I had a supervision yesterday and we were roughly talking about that same thing. Yeah, I use the trope of excavation quite heavily in the chapter in general because it's sort of the connecting thing between the two novels I'm working with. And it's sort of using the idea of excavating here of the chest and the gun in the other novel I'm working with. The novel ends with this sort of excavating a body that's a victim of the dictatorship. So this trope is, and I think it tells us something about the idea of this past being buried and this past being neglected and being sort of left behind, right? So that's sort of where I'm focusing with the idea of excavation. I'm quite interested in the idea of the fictionality of it, because something that is part of the context, especially when we talk about the dictatorship in itself, is that there has been forensic research being done about the victims of the invasion that's currently happening. And before, there was this intense archaeological research on victims of the dictatorship and these massacres by the dictatorship. But especially when we think about the dictatorship, the Commission of Truth happened 20 years after the invasion. So they were investigating crimes that had happened sometimes 40 years before. There was a lot of limitations and malpractice that happened with the Truth Commission as well, which is more of a gossip than anything. But that means that there's these gaps that have been left by the active excavation, right? There has been physical excavation that has happened a bit too late and a bit too poorly. And obviously, as we were talking yesterday, that this is not to say that it couldn't be done and that this truth cannot be found. But I think these novels are highlighting, are kind of like putting the focus on the image of excavation and putting the focus on how little we know, even though we've done these excavations, right? How many questions are still open. And I think that's where the trope comes in, that idea of, obviously the fictional texts are never going to give us the truth, and they don't claim to give us the truth, whatever that is, but they kind of make us pay attention to the lack of it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you, Nicole. That was very interesting. I'm maybe like following a bit on Steve's question. I'm super interested in the concept on how you're like defining in your conceptual framework the concept of transit. And I wonder if you could tell me like how are you positioning against other concepts that in cultural studies or we see like the borderland or the bridge, thinking more of Megan than you are here.
Yes.
Whether, because in her work, for example, the idea of transit would be more opening and expansive, and here you're using the other as something that's occluding and creating a substituting sort of like national narrative. And there's also definitely a difference between sort of more identity politics and national imaginary. So yeah, so whether you, I don't know, like what about this concept in relation to each other? And then my other question, that I mean, you've talked a bit about this, but I'm interested in how this idea of transit in the novel, whether it manifests also like aesthetically, where there's like a formal, I don't know,
Thank you. I think I have thought a lot about the idea of, particularly of the borderlands, of unfulfilled borderlands, and while transitism in itself is, there's obviously a definition that exists of transitism that has been done by Panamanian scholars, and it's a very economic centered concept. But something that I've been playing with throughout the thesis is what other forms of transit we see. And I think in my following chapter, there's a lot of the idea of transit, and this is sort of the contradiction in the history of the canal zone, is that you have the transit that happens through the canal, but there is also, while the canal zone exists, there is a disruption of transit because Panamanians cannot access the canal zone. There's a fence, and this is a great source of tension for the better part of the 20th century. So that fence kind of always makes me think a little bit of the borderlands that Ansel Dua talks about, and that idea of these fluid borders and what happens in these borders. So in my final chapter, I do engage with a novel that has this queer character, and it plays a lot with these ideas of fluidity in a very different way. So I think that is an interesting approach that I quite like about that chapter, is that I do spend a lot of time critiquing the idea of transitism as a national narrative, but then there's also space of thinking of other forms of transit. And in this novel, that takes shape in the form of, in this chapter, it takes shape with the whole kind of a route towards Central America. Like it's still a physical kind of route, but then in the next chapter we have these other forms of transit that are more, you know, gender and these other forms of mobility that we can find. In terms of the aesthetics, that's something I have to think about. I don't really have an answer for it, but I am going to think about it, and I'm going to write it down. Thank you.
My question is kind of linked as well. So I was thinking, you mentioned briefly about how people who are using might be racialized, right? And I'm thinking about the both transitive here and the difficult path. And I'm wondering if this novel or other novels that you're analyzing look to the racialization of Panamanians at all. I mean, you mentioned Dominican, all the way through. Like, where's she from?
Yeah, it's a weird name.
And then also just now with kind of the fences around the canal, or who built the canal. how does this figure into the novels? And if so,
I think it figures in some of the novels I'm working with, but it's also one of the biggest examples of the contradictions that are at the heart of the transitist model, right? Because as you very well said, and this is a very small footnote, but the canal was largely built by Black labor force, right? For immigrant workers that came from Barbados, from Jamaica, from Martinique, and all sorts of countries. And this created a whole number of tensions in Panama of this massive wave of immigration that was Black, that didn't speak Spanish, that wasn't Catholic, and that was sort of seen as a symbol of US colonialism, right? These people were brought here by the US, they're the enemy. So there's a lot of tension in that idea of a national narrative that sees the country as a crisol de razas, as this melting pot of, we are all friends and we're all the same. But at the same time, it's being very actively through legal and social conventions, creating these differences and so something that I think about in the first chapter of my analysis is this idea of how you can have a narrative that works on mobility and exchange, but you also want things to stay in a very specific way. And that has a lot of implications in when we talk about race, because you want this country to stay exactly the same with the mestizo, criollo elite, but we want the Black people to come and build the route of transit, right? So that is something that I do look, and I think with the exception of this novel, this chapter, in my other two chapters, I do have these characters that are quite peripheral in both cases, but that sort of come in sort of highlight that tension, particularly that racial tension that is so big in Panama. And you even see it, and this is a small commercial, Panama is going to a World Cup. And when you see, I'm going to say this forever now, but when you see Panama's national football team, it's a majoritarily Black team. And that is because it's a lot of people who are the descendants of the workers from the Caribbean, right? So, and I think that's a very good example, obviously way of my thesis here, but similar to how, France or England react to their kind of opportunistically to their Black or racialized players. There's this idea of these people are national heroes now, but then in any other conversation, they're not necessarily. So yeah, sorry, that was a massive side quest, but yeah.
Questions? Okay, well, if there are no more questions, we can thank Nicolle again, and we will go for a drink at what you call it, Alzamora.
Nice. Thank you. No lo sé, no tengo idea. No, es Henry. No tengo idea, no tengo idea. Es Henry Morgan, pero ahí decía Juan. Lo cierro la...